They in? Okay. Hi, everyone in the room and online. I'm not the speaker. I'm just introducing Brett, who joined the Sociology Department in October 2024 and is a member of CoDE. He's a senior research fellow who previously worked at Goldsmiths, the University of California and the University of Bristol. He gained his PhD in sociology from Southampton in 1999 with a thesis on race, modernity, and revolution in CLR James's Social Theory and Activist Practice, which drew on 9 months of archival research in the US. Oh, that's distracting. Then that was subsequently published into Rethinking Race, Politics, and Poetics, CLR James's Critique of Modernity. Brett's research centres on the sociology of ethnicity, race, and racism, specifically theoretical analyses of the relationship between deracialization and anti-racism. He's currently completing a book, which is kind of the background of what he's talking about today, provisionally entitled The Post-Racial Ambition, Eradicating Race, Challenging Racism. This project constructs a genealogy of racial eliminativism. We think that's how you say it, which is the discarding of the concept of race. He's charting its development from the late 18th century to the present, and the book also develops a critical analysis of the epistemological, methodological, ontological, ethical, and political arguments for the elimination of race. So Brett has applied this approach to the concept of BAME, not BAME, as an administrative and analytical category rather than an identity category. So he's going to explore that. First, the significance of calls to stop using BAME, and second, evaluating the arguments for retaining the concept. So he's going to encourage us to reflect on how we conceptualize ethnic categories, and I'll leave the rest to you.
Thanks very much, Siobhan. And thanks to all of you, those of you here. It's such a beautiful day. So thanks for taking the time, and thanks to everybody who's here with us online as well. So yes, the title here, Unhelpful and Redundant, as a question, Identity, Inequality, and the BAME Controversy. So my interest in BAME, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, is largely theoretical, but theoretical also in terms of how it's applied in concrete situations. And in relation to analyses of BAME.
Sorry, share the screen, they can't see the slide. Want to have?
Please.
Soon.
So I came out. Right.
Yeah, we forgot about that. And then go back to you.
Thank you. Okay. So it seems to me that there is quite a bit of work, applied analysis of BAME, especially, but not only, but especially within health literature, social medicine literature. But there doesn't seem to be that much developed sociological conceptual analysis, right? Focusing on the concept, the category in and of itself, but also in terms of its wider implications, its wider practical and political implications. So that's really what I want to be doing today. Just to provide, let me see if I can move this a bit.
You should be able to minimize this. You go to that little line.
Yeah. So just to provide a little context, as Siobhan said, racial eliminativism, I think that's how you say it. So this is really the theoretical framework that I'm looking to develop. It's the idea that it's largely philosophical, these debates, and I'm thinking about how to develop a social theory of racial eliminativism. And the idea is that race is problematic, right? Fundamentally problematic, epistemologically, methodologically, ontologically, ethically, politically, and therefore it should be eliminated. So this is, I think, a useful definition from the philosopher Paul Taylor. And as we can see, he says, an eliminativist is a racial skeptic for whom race talk is at best an egregious error and at worst a pernicious lie. Adherents of this perspective usually insist that we strike, that is, eliminate race from our ontological vocabularies. Now, I don't think you need to be a philosopher, a social scientist, an expert to realize there are certain problems with that statement or that objective. And just to quickly say, there are numerous critiques of racial eliminativism, and these are some of the main points that are made. So the first is to say that it's overly abstract, right? It's utterly impractical. What does it mean to say eliminate the category and concept of race altogether? How can that happen? Is there going to be an edict issued on a particular day that says, well, from this point onwards, there should be no more reference to or mention of race, right? Utterly abstract, utterly impractical. Another argument is to say that, well, in order to understand, let alone deal with racism, we need the category and concept of race. So there's a way in which eliminating race might be seen as a move against anti-racism. There's also an argument that this idea of eliminating race, enabling people to be who they understand themselves to be, instead of subscribing to certain kinds of scripted forms of racial behavior or attitudes or identity, is somewhat individualistic, right? So that there's a sense in which eliminating race can be seen as apolitical. But that notion of, enabling individuals to find, to form themselves might be seen as a quite liberal undertaking. And so there's another criticism of racial eliminativism as distinctively neoliberal, that it seeks to promote a certain kind of meritocratic ideal, and that this is also problematic because it can be used as a means to deny the existence of racism. Now, I want to say absolutely clearly, I think these are valid concerns, and I take them seriously. But I think that one of the points I want to make is that there are different forms of racial eliminativism. So I think when we hear the idea of racial eliminativism or reference to the post-racial, it's often referred to as if it's only one thing, whereas I think there are numerous approaches. And one of the things that I want to do is to think about whether there's a way to undermine race. So racial eliminativism as a process. So not in that sort of strong sense that Taylor's talking about, not to use the term, but to engage with the term critically, to undermine it, to, in a sense, stimulate that categorical and conceptual atrophy. So in that sense, we are not post-racial, or race hasn't been eliminated, but this is a sort of stated ambition, right? It's not an achieved end. There is no already existing post-racial society. There's also the problem of how this might happen, how to eliminate race. And it always reminds me of another issue discussed by the sociologist Bob Miles, in terms of we shouldn't make reference to race, right? We shouldn't reify race. Instead of talking about race, what we really should be talking about is the idea of race. And what the idea of race does is that it's believed to be real. It's employed in certain concrete social situations. So what we should be engaging with sociologically is racism, not race. Right? So race is an idea for Miles. Race in and of itself doesn't exist, but nevertheless, it leads to racism. And it's racism that's, for Miles, the proper object of sociological inquiry. So for me, thinking about racial eliminativism, there's a very important question, which is the question or the issue of whether racial eliminativism can be used to contribute to an analysis of racism that can have certain anti-racist applications. So this is to distinguish it from the kinds of neoliberal approach, the apolitical approach that can be used to deny the existence of racism. And so in that sense, I think that addressing BAME is useful. But BAME, as I think we all know, has been incredibly controversial. So today, what I'm going to do is to do two things as set out in the abstract: to offer a brief overview of the controversy surrounding BAME, and it is a brief overview, just outlining some of the arguments against the acronym and arguments for its disuse. But then I'm going to offer some arguments against its disuse and to think about why we might wish to retain it. Now, just a few methodological observations before I set off. That this paper is largely an interpretive theoretical textual analysis of BAME. I'm going to use some indicative materials for illustrative purposes. So this includes some reports, some blogs, some campaigns, and that in selecting these materials, I'm using a purposive form of sampling to assemble a population of relevant texts. And this is not representative of a population of texts itself. So the first thing to say, just a quick background, is to say that BAME is largely within the literature regarded as emerging during the 1990s, emerging as a successor to BME, Black and Minority Ethnic, which is largely understood as emerging during the 1980s. It's important to say that this doesn't mean there's a break, right? That there's a shift in absolute terms from BME to BAME, because we all know BME is still in use as well. The BAME emerges within public administration, largely as an administrative category. It has statistical uses. But just that distinction, that dichotomy between BME and BAME is important, or at least it signals an important issue. There's the sense in which BME was understood to be somewhat exclusionary, right? It names one group, it names Black and then minority ethnic. So that exclusionary argument forms the basis for the broadening out from BME to BAME, to include Asian as another named group alongside Black. So this is just to outline the beginning of the term, and I just want to now just outline some of the criticisms, some of the main criticisms. This is by no means all of the criticism of BAME, but just to outline some of the major points that are made. So the first thing to say, and what I'll also do, I'll give you some indicative texts or samples of texts to illustrate the points I'm making. I may read some of it at times, but I'll try not to do that thing where I treat you as if you can't read and just read what's on the screen. So the first 2 points in terms of the criticism of BAME is to say that it's homogenizing and demeaning and that it misrepresents identity. So the first slide here, we can see there's an argument that the use of the acronym serves to deny individuals agency in describing themselves as they understand themselves, right? That it also denies the rights of groups to self-representation. So I think it's that last section of this blog post from Sarah Austin, where she says, so I'm confused as to why this 4-letter acronym is considered sufficient to describe the diverse cultures of this vibrant portion of our UK citizenship. No one I know would describe themselves as BAME. So this idea that what we have within the term is diverse sets of peoples, diverse groups that are collapsed into this singular collective category. The category BAME is also seen as especially problematic for mixed race people. So there's YouGov research, for example, demonstrating that mixed race participants are especially unlikely to find BAME representative. And so part of the major problem here is the way in which the term has been used sometimes as a singular noun. It's been used as a group descriptor, that there's a reference sometimes to people who are, or to people as being BAME. And that's I try to not use that term. I hope I won't. I normally spell out the acronym. I don't refer to people as BAME. I would agree with Austin here, and I'm in that category of people who wouldn't describe themselves as BAME or as BAME. So first 2 things, homogenizing and demeaning, misrepresenting identity. The last 3 things I want to focus on in terms of the controversy, in terms of the critique of BAME, are what we can see here in terms of it minoritizing groups, excluding and subsuming groups, and then reiterating certain power asymmetries. So the first point is in relation to minoritizing groups. And there's the sense in which, within criticisms of BAME, that the acronym characterizes certain groups in terms of being quote unquote minorities, minority ethnic, as less important and somewhat marginal, that groups are therefore defined in terms of a lack, in terms of deficiency, or in terms of what's sometimes referred to in particular debates as a diversity deficit. Right? So people aren't seen in terms of what they are, people are seen in minimal terms. This is a sort of non-affirmative characterization of people, that people are either an absence, or if they are present, it's a somewhat minimal presence. So this first point is that characterizing people, characterizing groups as minorities is often seen as problematic. The next point is the point about excluding and subsuming groups. And one of the major concerns here is that use of BAME serves to reproduce a hierarchical color-based association, and that this hierarchical color-based association serves to foreground some groups and to marginalize others. So we see this just in the very title, right? The fact that two groups, so-called groups, are named and others aren't. So we have reference to Black, we have reference to Asian, and then everybody else who is included within the category, subsumed within the category, is not named. Right? So that that's an important form of exclusion and subsuming of people that happens within the use of the category. And indeed, we see that also in the shift from BME to BAME, right, with the inclusion of Asian in the development of the category. That we can see in this statement from the NHS Race and Health Observatory, the point about how BAME is felt by some respondents, that it subsumes Filipino within an Asian category where individuals understand themselves as such to be marginalized, right, by being subsumed within that category. And similarly, Peter Aspinall points out how certain Africans understand themselves as subsumed within that broader category of Black. So that, again, the use of the acronym serves to exclude certain groups, serves to subsume others. Another point that's made within a lot of the literature is that reference to BAME and in terms of minority ethnic can omit certain white ethnicities. Right? So one of the points that's made within the literature is that it omits quote unquote white Roma, Gypsy and traveller communities as some of the most discriminated against and oppressed groups in British society. And that when BAME is used or reference is made to the acronym, that typically those groups, Roma, Gypsy, traveller communities, are not being referred to within the use of the acronym. Okay, last overview, which is just to say something about how the term is understood sometimes as reiterating power asymmetries. So Deborah Gabriel makes the point here that what we can see within the use of BAME is the sort of stealthily centering of whiteness, that white becomes the norm, that people of color are marginalized in relation to. And elsewhere, the point is made that when this happens, it doesn't address certain power dynamics whereby both white and whiteness become obscured by the use of BAME, that issues of white privilege, issues of white supremacy go unchallenged, right? So white becomes this kind of centering term that is nonetheless absent within the use of the acronym. And that power asymmetries are also reproduced in terms of the BAME being used in certain instances to conceal inequality and to conceal discrimination as well. That organizations can declare that they have achieved certain BAME targets, but that this can be done to obscure certain kinds of specific ethnic group inequalities or exclusions or discriminations against particular ethnic groups. So particular ethnic groups may be underrepresented within a particular industry. And the example here is in relation to the cultural industries. So the use of BAME in terms of targets within certain sectors of the cultural industry, for example, is used as a way to not talk about the underrepresentation or the exclusion of certain particular ethnic groups. So the argument here is that, use of the acronym can serve to reiterate certain power asymmetries. So a really quick run through, this is by no means exhaustive, but these are just some of the problems with the term, right? That it's homogenizing and demeaning, that it misrepresents identity, that it minoritizes groups, it excludes and subsumes groups, and it reiterates certain power asymmetries. These are a number of problems. And as I said, it's not exhaustive. There are more problems with the term. So as a result, there's a suggestion, a large suggestion within the debate that BAME, the solution to the problem, the response to the controversy, is that the term should be disused. Right? So what I'm calling here categorical elimination. So there are a number of organizations, groups, bodies that argue for the disuse of BAME, and they're wide-ranging. So the major broadcasters, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, but also newspapers from The Guardian on one end to The Telegraph on another, voluntary associations, charities, think tanks, groups such as British Future, Sporting Equals, and the arts group, Arts Inc., with their BAME Over campaign. So a widespread argument for the disuse of BAME. The category is inherently problematic and it should not be used. That instead there should be use of specific ethnic group categories, that BAME, it's often argued, should be used intersectionally alongside other categories, or that quite simply there should be an alternative term that is used. Now, I understand, as was the case with racial eliminativism, the arguments against it. I understand those arguments. I agree with many of them, and I feel the same about the disagreement with BAME. But at the same time, I do think that there is a case for BAME. And one of the things, or one of the reasons why I think there's a case for the acronym, there's a case for the use of the acronym, is I'm not sure in relation to the problems that are specified in regarding BAME, is whether it's the term that's the problem or the problem is how it's being applied. It might be both, right? But what exactly is the problem? And it seems to me that the major issue is that BAME, at least how I understand the category, or I think the category can be used and is used in certain instances, is that it is not an identity descriptor. Right? It's not a category of identity. It doesn't refer to groups. No, it's not a proper noun. No one is BAME. This is one of the reasons I don't use that term, only to refer to the term that shouldn't be used. So there are many alternatives that have been suggested. I'll just outline some, right? And I'm doing this to make a particular point, that within these debates, it's argued that BAME shouldn't be used, and there are certain problems with BAME, right? That one is, for example, the fact that certain groups are named and others aren't. So when you name a particular group, certain groups are, those named groups are privileged and others are excluded, or that it references color, right, in terms of BAME, or there's a reference to minority, and we've seen that idea of BAME as minoritizing groups. But it seems to me that other terms that might be used instead, or perhaps alongside, also contain certain issues as well. So people of color, for example, within the literature, that's often referred to by some participants in studies as overly US specific. But also it problematically, for some, foregrounds color. Or Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, that what we have there is again reference to color and naming of particular groups. So where we have naming, we also have privileging. Right? We move on to another suggestion, African, Asian, and minority ethnic. This addresses the problem of color. We don't have the reference to color here, but we still have naming, privileging, and we still have reference to minority. The Hayward Foundation have suggested using ethnic minority in Britain instead of BAME, and that avoids color, it avoids naming and privileging, but it still makes reference to minority. And it doesn't only make reference to minority, but it goes back to the older formulation of ethnic minority as opposed to minority ethnic. Another suggestion, Black, Asian, and ethnically diverse, eradicates the problem of minority, but nevertheless, there is color and there's naming and privileging within that term. And the last one here, and again, this isn't exhaustive by any means, but reference to racially minoritized. So here there's no naming, so there's no privileging, there's no referencing to minority, but this is sometimes seen as somewhat unwieldy, right? Somewhat sort of jargon ridden and would have poor user comprehension, as is also the case with BAME. So I guess the point here for me is that BAME, to remember, is an administrative category. It's not a descriptor of identity. It's used to aggregate instances of exclusion, inclusion, discrimination, inequality. It relates to institutional, for example, procedures and practice. And so for that reason, it seems to me, when understood in that way, when applied in that way, it seems to me that BAME is important in relation to racism. It's important in relation to anti-racism. And for me, it would seem to be the case that the acronym has been misused. And that isn't then necessarily a problem or an inherent problem with the category itself. We're talking about a problem with its application or its misapplication. And to give an example of this, I just want to point out some of what I see as hazards in using BAME in terms of what I see as a somewhat quote unquote strange alliance. So I want to talk about the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities that the government formed in, Conservative government formed in 2020. The educationalist Tony Sewell was appointed as chair, and the commission was charged with or tasked with examining race and ethnic disparities in education, employment, crime, policing, and health. And the commission also was tasked with assessing BAME. And in the introduction, Sewell stated that, and I quote, "I wanted to call one of the chapters the end of BAME." The report was published in 2021, and just prior to publication, the report was trailed in the media, as is often the case, and it was trailed in the media with the comment that BAME is unhelpful and redundant, hence the title of this paper today, but I'm questioning that. So within the report, there's a section titled "Why BAME Doesn't Work." And what I've really noted, or what is really striking to me within that section, is just how much of the report there reiterates parts of the civil society critique that I've just gone through. So the first point is to say that the acronym within the report is seen to be no longer helpful, right? It's demeaning, it defines people in negative terms, right? What we are not, as opposed to affirmatively what we are. So it seems to me here, what we can see is that theme of homogenizing and demeaning, and BAME as also misrepresenting identity. We see that repeated here within the report. We also see a point that the acronym is somewhat of an obfuscation, right? That it's used to disguise huge differences in outcomes between ethnic groups. So it's somewhat simplistic, it's somewhat reductive, that it attributes all disparities to majority versus minority discrimination, that it enables institutions and businesses to foreground, as we see, the success of some BAME people in their organization and absolve themselves of responsibility for people from those minority groups that are doing less well. So again, it seems to me that we see that theme of excluding and subsuming groups. We see that theme of reiterating certain power asymmetries. And then finally, that's what you can't see there is it is time we dropped the term. Right? So in conclusion, that argument of the disuse of BAME, time to disuse the term. If we're going to use the term, or if we're going to make reference to people from particular ethnic backgrounds, to do it in particular ways. But the collective category, the BAME acronym itself, should be dropped, should be disused. So the following year, the government published a response to the Commission's report, Inclusive Britain. And in this response, 2 headline points, right? So disaggregate BAME, disuse the term, right? Disaggregate BAME and stop using aggregated terms. So no more BAME, term shouldn't be used, stop using disaggregate terms. And this is done for certain reasons. It's done for effective communication. It's done to move against that homogenizing of diverse groups. So as you can see here, to communicate more effectively and to avoid lumping together different ethnic minority groups. So this seems to me, again, to be quite striking. I think of this as a strange alliance, right, between a wide range of civil society groups, institutions, and then the Commission on Race and Ethnic Discrimination and the government position. Right? So we have varied groups across different social spheres, also markedly different political positions, all moving against BAME. And it seems to me it's an important question to ask, what does this mean? What does it mean for many civil society groups, some of whom will understand themselves as progressive in orientation? Some others might understand themselves as having particular kinds of anti-racist commitments. What does it mean to share this critique and prescription regarding BAME with the government? Right? What does it mean for that position to be shared? But also, what are some of the potential consequences of this? So it seems to me that one of the particular consequences of this that we can see within the government response, within Inclusive Britain, is an argument for the need to collect more granular data. Right? That BAME collapses a wide range of diverse groups within a singular category. And what we need is more granular data. And the report here, or the government response here, notes the necessity of, quote unquote, more sensitivity to differences within racial or ethnic groups. So what's being argued for here is that point about disaggregation. Right? We need to disaggregate. We shouldn't use aggregated terms like BAME. We need to disaggregate. But there are many organizations, including, for example, the Institute of Race Relations, the Runnymede Trust, Operation Black Vote, that argue or suggest that losing a collective term such as BAME and disaggregating ethnic inequality data can have certain problems. It can result in certain, perhaps unintended or unforeseen consequences, that it can restrict the capacity to identify and to combat institutional and structural racism. Now, this isn't necessarily the intention of particular groups in arguing against the use of BAME, but nevertheless, it can be an unintended or perhaps unintended consequence. And I just want to quickly give an example of this. It's what I think of as a crucial example, a statement that crystallizes this issue. And it's in relation to UK ethnic health inequalities during the pandemic. And it's in relation to a survey of health and care staff views undertaken by the Royal College of Nursing during the pandemic. And it's important because BAME staff were more likely to report a lack of available personal protective equipment, PPE. They were more likely to report a lack of available training in its use, as well as pressure to work without that PPE compared with white British staff. And the RCN provide a statement on the methodological rationale for and the practical necessity of using BAME as an aggregating term. And this statement, I know it's quite lengthy, but it seems to me it's really worth discussing or stating at length or repeating, because it does crystallize, I think, a crucial point. So they say overall, there were 4,418 combined responses from BAME, 728, and white British, 3,690 respondents to the second PPE survey. And to me, this next part is crucial. To have disaggregated.
I think I'd read this, gone through it. The point here that I want to make is about the point that's being made here about aggregating groups in order to have statistically significant numbers. So to me, there's the question of what's going on here. And if I go back to that critique of racial eliminativism, it seems to me that without using BAME, there's the potential for there to be that issue of no data. And if there's no data, there's no, how do we know that there's a problem? Okay? But that in addition to that, what we can see is a certain form or discourse of racism denial. And I see this particularly in use of the term disparity. It's a key term used by the Conservative government. We see it in the establishment of the Race Disparity Unit within the Cabinet Office in 2016, and also the publication of the Race Disparity Audit in 2017. And so that word disparity for me is key. Coleman Hughes makes the point that there are two forms, or we can think of racial disparity in two key ways. The first way is as a benign form, right? So that racial disparity is a form of disparity between groups that results from cultural and demographic differences. So there's a benign form of racial disparity. And this is separate from and set against what he understands as malignant disparities, which are derived from discrimination or unfair processes. So disparity takes form in different ways, in two different ways. It can be benign or it can be malignant. And it seems to me that within the Commission report, we see disparity referred to, but also through a range of other government, Conservative government publications, we see disparity referred to in that former sense, right, as benign. Right? This is, for me, this is absolutely crucial. So we see here that the Commission report notes a tendency to conflate discrimination and disparities. Whilst they sometimes coexist, they often do not, right? Okay. So in the use, you know, whether it's the Race Disparity Unit, whether it's the Commission, the government, disparity is designed to function as a benign label, right? It presents a more neutral, quote unquote, benign characterization of what is presented or what's intended to be demonstrated as relative intergroup social difference as opposed to inequality. So my concern is with disparity as a means to minimize, disparity as a means to deny racism. And that BAME is not about recording difference or benign forms of disparity. BAME is an administrative category, as I've said before, to determine levels of access and exclusion, for example, or levels of inclusion and participation. So what we see with the use of disparity is a certain kind of disparity dialectic within both the Commission report and Inclusive Britain in terms of how it moves against BAME. So on the one hand, we have a certain kind of move against racism, anti-racism. So we see what's being called a certain form of terminological inflation, that reference to racism is based on certain kinds of emotive, moralistic accusations, claims that are unsubstantiated, and that the very claim to the existence of racism is seen as socially divisive. That the people, the organizations discussing racism, announcing anti-racist strategies are socially divisive. They're harking back on the past, because this idea of Britain now as a meritocratic, more open society, a society offering far more opportunity, right? So in this sense, what we have is a certain kind of minimization of racism or a denial of the existence of racism. So that's one side of the dialectic in terms of making reference to disparity. But the other side is something else. So there's a part in the Commission report where they disparage the use of certain kinds of terms, or anti-racists' use of certain kinds of terms. And they specify two terms. One is white privilege, and the other is white fragility. And they say these are problematic terms. These terms are inflammatory. They shouldn't be used. They're inaccurate. They shouldn't be used. And there's this point that's made. I think this is, again, incredibly important. They say there is something, however, in the idea that even in a relatively open society like today's UK, a psychological comfort can be derived from looking like the majority of people around you. A better term, and when it says a better term, it means a better term than white privilege. Right? A better term which usefully captures the tendency for groups to favor their own is the concept of affinity bias. I'm seeing lots of quizzical faces now. But this is the point. This isn't white privilege. This isn't racism. This is affinity bias. And it mirrors what we see within a lot of racism denial literature and debates. So for example, this idea of, or the idea of racial self-interest, that there can be something called racial self-interest that is not in and of itself racism. This is simply a form of in-grouping, or what's sometimes referred to as a preference for, or quote unquote, preference for co-ethnics. This isn't anti-other, this is simply pro-self. So this is part of the argument that's made. We also know that these statements are used in part as justifications for nativism. It's used in part as justification for populist nationalism. So it seems to me that this is, and I'm not saying at all, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying this is the intention of all people arguing against the use of BAME. I'm not saying that whatsoever. But I'm saying that it's important to note that some parts of the argument against the use of the acronym serve this disparity dialectic. Right? To, on the one hand, deny the existence or to minimize racism, and then on the other hand, to excuse it, to explain it away, but not as racism, not as white privilege, but to describe it as affinity bias, a simple preference for one's own. Right? We're not against others, we're simply pro-self. So without BAME, we have the potential for that issue of no data, no problem. We have the potential for racism denial, and we also have the potential for a certain kind of racial and cultural pathology. So something else, again, within the Commission report, within Inclusive Britain, is a reference to quote unquote minority ethnic communities and families, and the certain kinds of values that those groups have, right? And that therefore what we have is a certain kind of standard ethnic, racial, cultural pathology, right? Where groups are seen to exhibit certain kinds of attitudes and behaviors that are the reason for an explanation for their social position instead of any form of disadvantage inequality, discrimination, racism, exclusion, and so on. So my last point is just simply to say that or to ask the question, where are we now? Because I'm well aware that I've been talking about that reference to disparity. It's the previous government, right? We had a general election last year. Have we moved on from that? Well, cosmetically, yes. I think the jury's out if it's any more than that. But following last year's general election, the race disparity unit has been renamed. So it's now the race equality unit. But at least as of yesterday, I haven't checked today, but at least as of yesterday, the race equality unit website still retains the race disparity unit best practice advice on BAME, which we can see here. We do not use the terms BAME because they emphasize certain ethnic minority groups and exclude others. The terms can also mask disparities between different ethnic groups and create misleading interpretations of data. This was found by research commissioned by the Race Disparity Unit, which found that, and I've emphasized, people from ethnic minorities were 3 times more likely to agree than disagree that the term BAME was helpful. So that enlisting, that co-opting, right, of minority ethnic people's unease, dissatisfaction with the acronym as a reason for its disuse. But that reason isn't a shared reason, it seems to me, in terms of being concerned with issues such as misrepresenting identity or homogenization, for example, but I think it has more to do with racism denial. Now, I accept that a relatively new government cannot necessarily be expected to have reviewed and amended all documentation from a previous administration. But I do note this race equality unit's retention of disparity and the commitment to abandon BAME, which I think should be monitored. And it seems to me, just the last point I want to make is that a key aspect of racial eliminativism and the process form of racial eliminativism that I'm interested in is an application of Karl Mannheim's idea of what he calls the extra theoretical function of a concept. And what Mannheim means by that is sometimes we have certain kinds of terms, concepts, that are problematic, and we try to clarify this concept or category. You know, what's correct? What is it really? But we can't define it, right? Or we can't come to any kind of consensus. And so we expend energy on an attempt at clarification when what we should be doing is not asking what is it, but asking what function does it serve, right? So in terms of racial eliminativism, I think the point about arguing against race isn't to actually eliminate race, to say from this day forward there shall be no race, but it's to create a debate where we're asking ourselves not what race is, because we can't agree. There's a very simple question we should be able to answer, which is how many races are there? But it depends who you read, right? So it's not the case of, well, what is race? What is race designed to do? And I would ask that similar question of BAME. What is it designed to do? I think it's important to have that debate, whether we want to keep the acronym or not. But I think if we have that debate, and we have that debate in terms broader than thinking about it as an identity descriptor, we can think about how it functions as a verb in relation to racism and anti-racism, instead of solely thinking about it or largely thinking about it as a noun and inadequate in terms of describing particular groups. Thank you.